Public Affairs Research Institute says local government is unable to find almost half of its operational costs from property taxes and municipal services. Their latest research shows that 25 years since democracy, many municipalities are in financial distress and access to affordable, quality services has not materialized for many people. To talk more about this research study, which in fact is due to be released tomorrow, we're joined by its author and senior researcher at the Public Affairs Research Institute. That's Dr. Tracy Ledger. Tracy, good morning. Thanks very much for your time on the AM report. It's very interesting always to come across research like this that very often does not paint a different picture to the one we've seen unfolding in our municipalities over the past 25 years. Year after year, we hear how municipalities are unable to not only meet the demands of residents, but deliver actual services.
Good morning. I think what we've tried to do in this report is to highlight the structural issues that are behind lots of these failings. So we have a lot of emphasis on the operational issues, on financial problems, financial irregularities, capacity in municipalities. And what we've done in the study is we've gone and focused on the underlying structural issues that are underpinning these, and specifically the local government fiscal framework.
Yes.
And essentially, the fiscal framework is what determines how much money local government has and what it spends it on. Now, when local government was designed in terms of the 1998 white paper, there were a particular set of assumptions that were made about the amount of money that local government could raise out of its own revenue, specifically property taxes and payment for services like electricity and water and sanitation. And the assumption was that these property taxes and these rates and these service payments could finance 73% of local government's operating expenditure in aggregate. Obviously, there'd be differences between wealthier and poorer municipalities. And this was a very important assumption because it means that local government gets the smallest share of national revenue, and very critical items have to be paid for out of that expenditure, notably infrastructure maintenance.
Yeah.
And what has happened is that these assumptions haven't materialized. So if we have a look at the actual situation with respect to rates and taxes, and particularly if we consider the growing percentage of bad debt on local government books, it appears to us that only slightly less than about 50% of operating expenditure as it currently stands can be financed from own income. And at the same time, one of the things we've forgotten is that a critical part of the developmental agenda was this idea of the social wage, that government would subsidize basic services or that they would be affordable for all households, and that would be an important way of addressing poverty and inequality. And quite the opposite has happened. We've seen these above inflation increases in services. They've put the cost of electricity and water and property taxes out of reach of the poorest households. The subsidy of free basic services doesn't cover that. So we've got the situation where more and more households can't afford to pay for services, and local government isn't getting enough money to keep the whole thing stable. And eventually it's going to fall off a cliff.
Well, that's my next question to you, Tracy. What you've just described to us, what does that mean for our developmental goals as a country, and if we take it down to local level?
What we're saying is it means we need to fundamentally overhaul the entire structure of local government. You know, we embarked on an experiment with very little historical precedent. We built a completely new system of local government. It was a much more radical transformation than the changes we saw in national and provincial government. We made assumptions about how it would work, and now after 20 years of empirical evidence, we need to be honest and say it's not working. We need to fundamentally overhaul local government. We need a structure of local government that fits the funding that we have. And in fact, the funding should be lower if we accommodated the social wage. We need to go back to the drawing board and redesign local government. Because what's going to happen is we're going to end up with more and more municipalities that are just paralyzed because they don't have the resources to do anything. And at the end of the day, it's people's constitutional rights that are going to be compromised.
Tracy, did your research look into the issue of corruption at municipal level? You know, whenever we cover stories around corruption, and whenever the AG's report does come out, there's a big focus on just the extent of corruption that takes place, particularly at the level of the municipality. How far did this research go to track the role that that plays in delivering services to the people?
Well, obviously we looked at how could we address the situation, and one of the ways in which you can make more money available in the system is by reducing the leakages out of the system. But if we look at the level of irregular expenditure and the level of fruitless and wasteful expenditure and the level of material irregularities, obviously we cannot afford to lose one single cent out of the system. But the amount of money that is completely lost to corruption is only about 5% of local government total operating expenditure in a year. So that's a relatively small amount. We lose a lot of money through distribution losses in the system because of old infrastructure. And obviously the question is whether or not, even if government is spending money that's in compliance with the regulation, are we making the best choices about what we're spending money on? So you can buy something in local government and tick all the boxes and it's compliant, but it's not in the best interests of advancing the developmental agenda.
Yeah, and
so,
that,
you know, I think, yeah,
sorry to interrupt you there, Tracy, and that speaks to the issue of the amount of money we've spent in many municipalities, large parts of which still don't have access to proper sanitation or even running water. But if you go back to the books of that municipality, you'll see that billions has been spent on that very issue.
Exactly. And I think what we need to do is we need to have some empirical evidence to underpin this debate. So what we need is actually to go back to the drawing board and say, right, this is what the money that local government should be spending. These are the things they shouldn't be spending money on, whether it's luxury motor vehicles or entertainment or functions, whatever. These are the fees that households can afford to pay. What kind of financial model does that give us, and what structure of local government can we essentially buy with that funding? But it's quite clear that the current structure is simply unsustainable.
So what does it take then to rejig the entire system? Who do you need buy-in from?
Well, I think we need buy-in, obviously, from the critical national departments. That's the National Department of COGTA. National Treasury is also important. Organized local government, but mostly the average South African who, you know, can no longer afford to pay their municipal rates bill, who see that their infrastructure is collapsing. We, you know, in order to rescue the mandate of developmental local government, we need to accept that we cannot continue like this. And the first part to any solution is admitting that you have a problem and start to build a different kind of structure of local government. And there are obviously precedents for demarcation and changing. Obviously, a lot of the functions of local government are set out in the Constitution, and you wouldn't want to change that. You wouldn't want to say we're going to have a less effective local government. But we need a completely different way of doing business, and in order to have a different way of doing business, we need a fundamentally different operating structure to deliver that, something that's more efficient and more effective and can deliver better economies of scale and better services at a lower cost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one thing we can all agree on. Municipalities can certainly do with a better way of doing business. Thanks very much for your time. Dr. Tracy Ledger is a senior researcher at the Public Affairs Research Institute, also the author of this latest research that shows that municipalities, very many of them in financial distress, access to affordable quality services not materialized for most people around the country.